They called the boy foolish for spending his savings on that horse. But what happened on the day of the competition made even the judge tremble. Tommy Reynolds woke to the rattling of the washing machine next door, its uneven spin cycle vibrating through the thin wall beside his bed. He'd grown used to the noise in the 3 months since moving in with the Pearsons, his 7th foster family in 12 years. The smallest bedroom in the house, tucked away next to the laundry room, had become his sanctuary despite its flaws. Or maybe because of them. No one else wanted this room, which meant he might actually get to stay in it for a while. He rolled over and faced the faded poster of Secretariat that he'd carefully hung on his first day. The legendary racehorse's red coat gleamed even through the worn paper, those powerful legs frozen mid-stride as they carried him to his historic Triple Crown victory. Tommy traced the outline with his eyes as he did every morning, a ritual that felt like touching something sacred. $25.42, he whispered to himself, reaching under his mattress for the battered coffee can where he kept his savings. Every penny earned from delivering newspapers before dawn and mowing lawns on weekends went into this can. He counted the bills and coins again, though he knew the exact amount by heart. At this rate, it would take years to save enough for even the cheapest horse. But a boy could dream. The bedroom door creaked open, and Mrs. Pearson poked her head in. "Tommy, you'll be late for school if you don't hurry." "Yes, ma'am," he said, quickly tucking the can back under his mattress. She hesitated, her eyes drifting to the poster. "You really love horses, don't you?" Tommy nodded, not trusting his voice. Most adults didn't understand his obsession. They saw it as childish, something he'd grow out of eventually. "Well, breakfast is ready whenever you are," she said with a small smile before closing the door. The Pearsons were nice enough, nicer than most of the families he'd stayed with. They fed him well, bought him new clothes for school, and never raised their voices. But Tommy had learned long ago not to get too attached. Temporary was the taste he knew best, more familiar than any home-cooked meal. As he dressed for school, Tommy's mind drifted to 6 years earlier, the night that had changed everything. He'd been living with the Morgans then, his 2nd foster family. A violent thunderstorm had rattled the windows, and amidst the chaos, he'd heard a strange sound from the backyard. While the adults argued on the phone about his placement, the Morgans had suddenly decided he was too quiet and a bit odd with animals. Tommy had slipped outside. There, beneath the old oak tree, he'd found a baby owl, fallen from its nest and trembling in the rain. Without thinking, he'd sat down cross-legged beside it, sheltering the tiny creature with his cupped hands. For hours, he'd whispered stories as the storm raged, until both he and the owl fell asleep, their breathing synchronized in perfect harmony. His social worker had found him like that the next morning, the small bird nestled peacefully in his palms. The woman's expression had been unreadable as she'd called wildlife rescue, but Tommy had overheard her muttering to the Morgans, "The kid's got a gift. Shame you can't see it." That night, he'd been moved to a new home. Tommy shook off the memory as he grabbed his backpack. He had newspaper routes to plan after school, and Mr. Jenkins had mentioned his lawn needed mowing this weekend. $25 would soon be $30. The hallways of Oakwood Middle School hummed with the usual morning chaos. Tommy kept his head down, navigating the crowd with practiced invisibility. It almost worked. "Hey, horseboy, drawing more ponies today?" Brad Montgomery's voice cut through the noise, followed by snickering from his ever-present entourage. Brad was 13, a year older than Tommy, and the son of Harrison Montgomery, the most powerful horse breeder in Kentucky. This fact alone made him royalty at Oakwood. Tommy clutched his backpack tighter and kept walking. "I asked you a question, foster freak," Brad said, stepping directly into Tommy's path. He was taller by at least 5 inches, his expensive clothes and perfectly styled hair a stark contrast to Tommy's second-hand jeans and self-cut brown mop. "Please move," Tommy said quietly. Brad snatched the sketchbook poking out of Tommy's backpack. "Let's see what masterpieces we have today." Pages flipped as Brad displayed Tommy's drawings to the growing audience. Dozens of horses sketched in pencil on cheap notebook paper. Some galloping, some grazing, all rendered with surprising detail for a 12-year-old's hand. "Look at this," Brad laughed. "Horseboy thinks he's an artist. My dad says people like you should learn useful skills, like cleaning stables. That's as close as you'll ever get to owning a horse." Tommy reached for his sketchbook, his face burning. "Give it back." "Or what?" Brad's smile turned mean. "Your imaginary horse friend's gonna come rescue you?" Just as Tommy prepared himself for the inevitable shove, a sharp voice cut through the hallway. "Mr. Montgomery, that doesn't belong to you." Mrs. Rodriguez, Tommy's history teacher, approached with a stern expression. Brad immediately adopted an innocent smile. "We were just looking at Tommy's drawings, Mrs. Rodriguez. They're really good. I'm sure they are. Now hand it back and get to class before I assign extra homework." Brad tossed the sketchbook at Tommy's feet. As he walked away, he whispered, "See you around, horseboy." Tommy bent to retrieve his sketches, carefully smoothing the crumpled pages. Mrs. Rodriguez watched him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Tommy, there's an annual horse auction at Churchill Downs this weekend. They sometimes have educational programs for students before the main event." Tommy's head snapped up. "At Churchill Downs? The real one?" She nodded. "My brother works security there. I could ask if he could get you in early, if you'd like to see the facilities." For the first time that day, Tommy smiled. "Yes, ma'am, I'd like that very much." The Saturday dawned clear and cool, perfect Kentucky autumn weather. Tommy had barely slept, counting and recounting his money throughout the night. By morning, he'd made a decision. He would take his entire savings to the auction. Not to buy anything, of course. That would be ridiculous. But just to feel for one day like someone who could. The coffee can now contained $87.42, 18 months of saved pennies, nickels, and dollars. He wrapped it carefully in a paper bag and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Churchill Downs loomed against the morning sky, its famous twin spires reaching toward the clouds. Tommy followed Mrs. Rodriguez's brother through a side entrance, his heart pounding as they passed through areas normally restricted to the public. "Auction's not till noon," the security guard explained, "but you can watch them preparing the horses if you'd like." Tommy nodded eagerly, unable to find his voice as they entered the stables. The smell hit him first, hay and leather and horses, a scent that felt more like home than any house he'd ever lived in. Thoroughbreds watched from their stalls, some curious, others indifferent to the small boy passing by. "These are the cream of the crop," the guard explained. "$1 million horses with pedigrees longer than your arm. But the auction's mostly for the others. Retired racers, breeding stock that didn't work out, problem horses." "Problem horses?" Tommy asked. "Ones that don't run fast enough or have behavior issues or got injured." The man's expression darkened. "Some end up with good homes. Others." He didn't need to finish. Tommy knew where unwanted horses often went. They rounded a corner, and the guard checked his watch. "I've got to start my rounds. You can stay here until the public arrives. Just don't go wandering off into restricted areas." Left alone, Tommy drifted toward a separate section of stalls set apart from the others. A sign read, "Lot B, Mixed Auction." Here, the horses seemed different, older, less valuable, eyes more wary. At the very end of the row, a stall stood slightly apart from the others. Tommy approached slowly, drawn by something he couldn't name. Inside stood a magnificent black horse, 16 hands tall, with a sleek coat that should have gleamed but was dull from neglect. The animal's powerful body was tense as a violin string, and on its right hind leg was something Tommy had never seen before, a metal prosthetic limb, carefully engineered to replace what had once been flesh and bone. A small placard on the stall read simply, "Thunderbolt, age 7, former stakes winner, accident, special considerations." The horse's eyes fixed on Tommy, dark, intelligent eyes that had seen too much. When a handler approached a neighboring stall, Thunderbolt reared violently, metallic leg flashing as powerful hooves struck the air. His shrill whinny cut through the stable like a knife. "Stay back from that one, kid," called the handler, giving the stall a wide berth. He's Montgomery's stock gone bad. Put 3 men in the hospital already. Tommy didn't move. Something about those eyes held him rooted to the spot. The stable gradually filled with potential buyers and spectators. Tommy retreated to a corner, watching as elegant women in expensive boots and men in Stetson hats evaluated the merchandise. He felt painfully out of place in his worn jeans and scuffed sneakers. At noon precisely, a bell rang, and the auction began. Tommy stayed hidden in his corner as horses were led out one by one, bid upon and sold. Prices ranged from thousands of dollars for promising young stock to a few hundred for older animals. As the afternoon wore on, they reached the stall at the end. 2 handlers approached Thunderbolt cautiously, carrying long poles with loops at the end. The horse immediately became agitated, ears flattened, teeth bared. "Lot 42, announced the auctioneer with noticeable hesitation. "Thunderbolt, 7-year-old thoroughbred, former stakes winner. Special considerations due to prosthetic limb. Bidding starts at $500. Silence fell over the auction house, not a single hand raised. From the VIP section, a tall man in an expensive suit stood up. Even from a distance, Tommy recognized Harrison Montgomery from newspaper photos. The breeding magnate removed his Stetson hat and addressed the crowd. "Let's not waste time here," he said, his voice carrying effortless authority. $75 for the knacker, unless anyone wants this problem. No Montgomery horse with a broken leg will tarnish my reputation. The knacker, slang for those who bought horses for slaughter. Tommy felt his stomach twist. More silence. People looked away, just as they did from Tommy in the school hallways. Before he could think, Tommy's hand shot up. I'll give 75. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Harrison Montgomery squinted, trying to locate the source of the bid. When his eyes found Tommy, small, obviously poor, clearly out of place, his expression shifted from surprise to amusement. Montgomery stepped down from the VIP section, snakeskin boots clicking against the concrete floor as he approached. The crowd parted before him like water. "Son," he said, towering over Tommy, "that animal has sent 3 handlers to the hospital. He's not even good enough for glue." Tommy's hands trembled as he pulled out his paper bag and began counting wrinkled bills. $75, he repeated, voice barely audible. The auctioneer, clearly enjoying the unexpected entertainment, looked to Montgomery for guidance. The breeding magnate gave a dismissive wave. "Sold to the boy for $75, the auctioneer announced, bringing down his gavel with a theatrical flourish. "And may God have mercy on his soul." Nervous laughter followed Tommy as he walked toward the stall, clutching his receipt. A veterinarian in a white coat tried to intercept him. "Young man, this isn't a pony. This is a dangerous animal with serious psychological trauma. You can't possibly manage." Tommy walked past him, focused entirely on the stall ahead. Warnings and muttered comments washed over him unheard. He stopped 3 meters from Thunderbolt, who watched him with those intense, wary eyes. "Hi," Tommy said softly. "I know you're scared. I am too." The horse, who moments before had threatened anyone approaching, fixed his deep brown eyes on the boy. There was something in that gaze, recognition perhaps. Tommy didn't move. He just waited, breathing slowly as he had with the injured animals he'd found over the years. Then the impossible happened. Thunderbolt, the terror of the stable, slowly lowered his head until his muzzle almost touched Tommy's chest. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The veterinarian dropped his clipboard. Harrison Montgomery frowned, suddenly suspicious. "Damn," muttered an old handler. "In 40 years I've never seen anything like it." And so, with $87.42 minus 75, but a heart overflowing with hope, Tommy Reynolds became the owner of a horse nobody wanted, except him. As Tommy tentatively reached out to touch Thunderbolt's muzzle, the entire auction house fell silent, until Harrison Montgomery broke the moment. "You've bought yourself a problem, boy. And you can be sure I'll be watching when he shows his true colors." A cold smile crossing his face as he turned away, the metallic sound of his spurs echoing through the hall. Tommy's heart pounded as Harrison Montgomery's spurs echoed through the auction hall. The boy stood frozen, his hand still extended toward Thunderbolt's muzzle, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes fixed upon them. The magnificent black horse hadn't moved, his gaze locked with Tommy's in a silent communication that transcended words. "What now?" Tommy whispered, the reality of his impulsive purchase suddenly crashing down on him. He owned a horse, a massive traumatized thoroughbred with a prosthetic leg and nowhere to keep him. A weather-beaten man in worn denim overalls approached cautiously. "You got transport for him, son?" Tommy blinked. He hadn't thought that far ahead. No, sir." The man scratched his stubbled chin. "Figured as much. Name's Pete. I haul horses for some of the smaller operations around here." He nodded toward Thunderbolt. "I can give you two a ride, but you better have somewhere to take him." Tommy swallowed hard. "Thank you, sir. I just need to figure out where—" Pete's eyes softened. "Better decide quick. They'll want this stall cleared within the hour." Tommy led Thunderbolt through the streets of Louisville, drawing curious stares from passers-by. The horse followed him with surprising willingness, the metal prosthetic creating an uneven rhythm against the pavement. Clomp, clink, clomp, clink. Pete had dropped them at the edge of town, unable to wait while Tommy sorted out his predicament. "Just keep a good hold on that lead rope," Pete had advised. "And remember, no sudden movements." The first stable Tommy approached was Riverside Equestrian Center, a modest facility where school horses lived alongside privately owned mounts. The manager took one look at Thunderbolt's prosthetic leg and shook her head. "We're not equipped for special needs horses," she said, not unkindly. "And isn't that the Montgomery stallion that went crazy after his accident? Sorry, kid. Too much liability." The story repeated at Greenfield Stables and then again at Oak Haven Farm. Each time, recognition dawned in their eyes when they saw the former champion, followed by thinly veiled fear and polite rejection. As afternoon faded toward evening, desperation set in. Tommy's arms ached from holding the lead rope, and Thunderbolt's initial patience was wearing thin. The horse snorted and pawed at the ground, sensing his handler's anxiety. "It's okay," Tommy soothed, though he didn't believe it himself. "We'll find somewhere." At the far edge of town, where neat suburban developments gave way to scattered farms, Tommy spotted a small hand-painted sign, "Wilson Ranch, fresh eggs and riding lessons." The property beyond showed signs of age, weathered fence posts, peeling paint on the small farmhouse, a barn that leaned slightly to one side. But everything was meticulously maintained, with fresh whitewash covering old wood and carefully mended fencing around the paddocks. Taking a deep breath, Tommy turned up the gravel driveway. An elderly woman emerged from the barn, wiping her hands on faded jeans. Her silver hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and deep lines fanned from the corners of her eyes, evidence of a lifetime spent squinting into the sun. "Can I help you?" she called, then stopped short when she noticed Thunderbolt. Her eyes widened, moving from the horse's powerful frame to his prosthetic leg, then to the small boy holding the lead rope. "Ma'am," Tommy began, his voice cracking, "I'm looking for a place for my horse. Just temporarily, until I figure something out." The woman approached slowly, her eyes never leaving Thunderbolt. The horse's ears flicked forward with interest rather than pinning back in aggression. "That's Thunderbolt," she said, not a question but a statement. "Harrison Montgomery's stakes winner." Tommy nodded. "Yes, ma'am, I bought him at the auction today." She studied Tommy for a long moment. "You bought a Montgomery thoroughbred? How old are you, boy?" 12, ma'am. My name's Tommy Reynolds." "Martha Wilson," she replied, extending a weathered hand which Tommy shook awkwardly, while maintaining his grip on the lead rope. "And what's a 12-year-old doing with a horse like this?" Tommy explained the auction, his impulsive bid, and the subsequent search for shelter. Throughout his story, Mrs. Wilson's expression remained unreadable, though her eyes occasionally flicked to Thunderbolt with something like recognition. When he finished, she sighed deeply. "You know what you've taken on? This isn't a pony from the carnival. This is a 1,000-pound animal with a history." "I know he's had a hard time," Tommy said quietly, "but they were going to send him to the slaughterhouse." Mrs. Wilson's face softened slightly. My ranch isn't much these days. Used to be 10 acres, but I had to sell half when Arthur, my husband, passed. 5 acres is all that's left, barely surviving against Montgomery's empire expanding next door. She gestured toward a distant fence line where immaculate white post and rail fencing marked the boundary of a much larger, more pristine equestrian facility. I've got 2 empty stalls, she continued. One for my old lesson pony who died last winter, and one Arthur always kept ready for rescues. A faint smile touched her lips. My Arthur had a soft spot for lost causes. Hope flickered in Tommy's chest. Would you rent one to me? I don't have much money left, but I could work. Work indeed, Mrs. Wilson interrupted. A stall, water, and basic feed in exchange for mucking out all the stalls daily, helping with repairs, and feeding my 3 remaining horses morning and night. That's my offer. Tommy nodded eagerly. Yes, ma'am. I can do that. Mrs. Wilson studied him one last time, then looked at Thunderbolt. There's something between you two. Can't quite put my finger on it, but… She shook her head. Arthur would have liked you. He believed in impossible things too. That evening, Tommy called the Pearsons from Mrs. Wilson's kitchen phone, explaining his situation in halting sentences. Mrs. Pearson's voice tightened with concern. Tommy, honey, a horse is an enormous responsibility, and from what you're describing, this one has… issues. I know it sounds crazy, Tommy admitted, but I couldn't let them kill him. There was a long pause before Mr. Pearson's voice came on the line. Tommy, we need to discuss this properly when you get home. This isn't like taking in a stray cat. Yes, sir, Tommy replied, his stomach knotting with anxiety. Mrs. Wilson says I can come back early tomorrow before school to get Thunderbolt settled. After hanging up, Mrs. Wilson handed him a mug of hot chocolate. Foster parents? She asked gently. Tommy nodded, surprised by her perception. Thought so, she said. My sister took in foster children for 30 years. I recognize that careful way of talking to adults. She sipped from her own mug. They good people, these Pearsons? Yes, ma'am. Better than most. Then they'll understand. Maybe not right away, but they will. She stood up. Come on. Let's make sure your boy is settled for the night. In the small stall bedded with fresh straw, Thunderbolt seemed to relax slightly, though he still kept a watchful eye on every movement. Mrs. Wilson showed Tommy where the feed and equipment were stored, explaining the morning routine with brisk efficiency. I'm up at 5, she concluded. But I expect you'll want to be here earlier to care for him before school. Tommy nodded, already calculating the route from the Pearsons' house to the ranch on his bicycle. It would be at least 8 kilometers each way. I'll be here by 4:30, he promised. In the pre-dawn darkness the next morning, Tommy pedaled his old bicycle through empty streets, a small flashlight taped to the handlebars providing minimal illumination. His legs burned with the effort of maintaining speed up the long hills, but he pushed on, driven by the knowledge that Thunderbolt was waiting. The eastern sky was just beginning to lighten when he turned up the gravel drive to Wilson Ranch. To his surprise, lights already glowed in the barn. He found Mrs. Wilson measuring feed into buckets. Right on time, she noted with approval. Thought I'd get a head start today, show you the ropes. Tomorrow it's all yours. Together they fed the 3 lesson horses, gentle, aging animals that watched the newcomers with mild interest. When they reached Thunderbolt's stall, the black horse was standing alert, ears pricked forward at the sound of Tommy's voice. Morning, Tommy said softly. Brought you breakfast. He opened the stall door cautiously, expecting Thunderbolt to retreat to the far corner as he had the previous evening. Instead, the horse took a step forward, nostrils flaring as he investigated the feed bucket. Tommy held his breath, extending the bucket slightly. Thunderbolt hesitated, then lurched forward suddenly, grabbing a mouthful of grain before backing away. Mrs. Wilson watched from a safe distance. He's testing boundaries, she observed. Seeing what you'll allow. Tommy placed the bucket on the ground and backed away, giving the horse space. I just want him to feel safe. Safe is earned, not given, Mrs. Wilson replied. He needs consistency more than anything. Same person, same time, same routine. Horses, are creatures of pattern. By the time Tommy finished his morning chores, the sun had fully risen and he was already late for school. He pedaled desperately, arriving sweaty and exhausted just as the second bell rang. His history teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, raised an eyebrow at his disheveled appearance but said nothing as he slipped into his seat. Throughout the day, Tommy struggled to focus, his mind constantly returning to Thunderbolt. Had the horse eaten all his feed? Was the prosthetic bothering him? What if he became agitated in the unfamiliar environment? When the final bell rang, Tommy was the first out the door, sprinting to the bike rack and pedaling back toward Wilson Ranch with renewed energy despite his exhaustion. For the next week, Tommy maintained the grueling schedule without complaint. Up at 4, cycling to the ranch by 4:30, completing chores until 7, racing to school, usually late, then returning immediately after the last bell to spend evenings with Thunderbolt before cycling home in the dark to tackle homework with heavy eyelids. The Pearsons, initially concerned, observed the transformation in their normally reserved foster son with cautious optimism. There was a new purpose in his eyes, a determination that hadn't been there before. "I've never seen him so committed to anything," Mrs. Pearson remarked as they watched Tommy depart in the pre-dawn darkness, reflective strips hastily sewn onto his jacket by Mr. Pearson after the second day. "Boy needs something that's his," Mr. Pearson replied thoughtfully. "Something no one can take away when he moves again." The unspoken reality of foster care hung between them, the knowledge that Tommy had lived with the taste of impermanence for most of his young life. At the ranch, Thunderbolt remained unpredictable. Some days he allowed Tommy to place feed in his stall without incident. Other days he charged the door aggressively, forcing the boy to drop the bucket and retreat. His powerful body remained tense, eyes vigilant for perceived threats. On the 6th day, Tommy arrived to find Thunderbolt particularly agitated, pacing his stall and snorting at shadows. Every attempt at approach was met with flattened ears and threatening posture. Instead of persisting, Tommy simply sat on an overturned bucket outside the stall and pulled out the battered harmonica Mr. Pearson had given him, a relic from his own childhood that he'd passed on when noticing Tommy's interest in music. The first notes were uncertain, wavering in the morning air. Tommy knew only simple melodies, taught by a music teacher at his third foster home. But as he played, something remarkable happened. Thunderbolt's pacing slowed. The horse's ears, previously pinned back in aggression, swiveled forward with interest. Tommy continued playing, switching to a slow, gentle tune. Thunderbolt gradually stilled, then moved toward the stall door, watching Tommy with intense focus. When the melody ended, man and horse regarded each other in silence. Tommy didn't move, didn't try to approach. He simply acknowledged the moment of connection with a quiet "thank you" before resuming his chores. That evening, as Tommy sat cross-legged on the ground outside the stall reading his history homework aloud, Mrs. Wilson observed from the barn doorway. Thunderbolt stood near the stall door, head lowered, listening to the boy's voice with what could only be described as attention. "Horses choose their humans," she murmured to herself, echoing words her Arthur had often spoken, not the other way around. At dawn on the 10th day, Tommy arrived at the stable to find something different. Instead of maintaining his usual wary distance, Thunderbolt walked directly to the stall door as Tommy approached, extending his muzzle in greeting, as if he had been waiting. On a distant hill, a black car briefly stopped, binoculars glinting in the rising sun. The black car disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Tommy with a strange feeling of being watched. But this concern quickly faded as he focused on the miracle before him. Thunderbolt had approached the stall door voluntarily, his ears pricked forward with interest rather than flattened in aggression. "Hey there," Tommy whispered, hardly daring to move. "You remember me today." The morning sun filtered through the stable windows, casting golden bars across the straw-covered floor. For several moments, boy and horse remained perfectly still, sharing breath in the quiet dawn. Tommy noticed how Thunderbolt's eyes, deep pools of chestnut brown, seemed clearer today, less clouded by fear. "I brought you something," Tommy said, slowly reaching into his pocket to produce a small green apple. He held it flat on his palm, arm extended but not pushing forward into the horse's space. Thunderbolt's nostrils flared, taking in the scent. The massive horse shifted his weight, the metallic prosthetic leg making a soft sound against the straw. 23 days had passed since the auction. 23 mornings of Tommy arriving before sunrise, offering food, cleaning the stall, and simply being present, sometimes reading aloud from his textbooks, sometimes playing quiet melodies on his harmonica, but always there. With deliberate slowness, Thunderbolt extended his neck, lips reaching toward the apple. Tommy held his breath. The horse's whiskers tickled his palm before Thunderbolt delicately took the fruit, retreating to chew it thoughtfully. "Good boy," Tommy whispered, blinking back unexpected tears. That's real progress. As he went about his morning chores, Tommy noticed how Thunderbolt watched his movements across the stable, not with the hypervigilant anxiety of previous days, but with something that resembled curiosity. The horse's gaze followed him from stall to stall as he mucked out the other horses' spaces and distributed fresh hay. "He's studying you," Mrs. Wilson observed, appearing in the doorway with 2 steaming mugs. She handed one to Tommy. "Hot chocolate. You've earned it." "Thanks," Tommy said, accepting the mug gratefully. "Do you think he's starting to trust me?" Mrs. Wilson leaned against the doorframe, observing Thunderbolt with experienced eyes. "Trust is earned in drops and lost in buckets. You've collected a few drops. That's more than most people get with a horse like him." She sipped her drink, then added, "I've been watching him. The way he uses that prosthetic, it's remarkable. Most horses would fight it, but he's adapted. There's determination in that animal." Tommy nodded, remembering how Thunderbolt shifted his weight to accommodate the artificial limb, making subtle adjustments with each step. "It's like he knows it's part of him now." "Horses live in the present more than we do," Mrs. Wilson said. "They don't waste time wishing things were different." That afternoon at Oakwood Middle School, Tommy struggled to keep his eyes open during English class. His grueling schedule was taking its toll, leaving dark circles beneath his eyes. "Tommy?" Ms. Parker's voice cut through his fatigue-induced haze. "The poem analysis." He straightened, blinking rapidly. "I'm sorry, Ms. Parker. Could you repeat the question?" The teacher approached his desk, concern replacing irritation when she noticed his exhaustion. "See me after class, please." When the bell rang, Tommy remained seated as his classmates filed out. Ms. Parker pulled a chair beside his desk. "You've been falling asleep in my class for 2 weeks, she said directly. "What's going on?" Tommy hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I bought a horse, ma'am. He needs special care, so I get up really early to look after him before school." Ms. Parker's eyebrows shot up. "A horse? That's not what I expected." Her expression softened. "Your writing assignment last month about what you'd do if you could change one thing in your life. You wrote about saving enough money to rescue an injured racehorse." Tommy nodded, surprised she remembered. "I thought it was just a creative exercise," she continued. "But you actually did it, didn't you?" "Yes, ma'am. His name is Thunderbolt. He was going to be sent to slaughter because of his prosthetic leg." Something shifted in Ms. Parker's expression. "My brother lost his leg in Afghanistan. People treated him differently afterward, like he wasn't whole anymore." She paused. "Your horse, is he adjusting?" "A little more each day," Tommy replied. "It's not just the leg. Something happened to him before. He's scared of most people." "But not you?" Tommy shrugged. "He's starting to trust me, I think. This morning he took an apple from my hand for the first time." Ms. Parker smiled. "That sounds like progress worth celebrating." She reached into her desk and pulled out a small book. "Here, poems about horses. Maybe you could read some to him." Tommy accepted the book, running his fingers over the worn cover. "Thank you, Miss Parker. Just try to stay awake in my class," she said, her stern tone undermined by the warmth in her eyes. "And Tommy? I'd like to hear more about Thunderbolt sometime." That evening, as golden light slanted through the stable windows, Tommy sat cross-legged outside Thunderbolt's stall, reading aloud from Ms. Parker's book. The horse stood near the door, head lowered, ears swiveling toward the boy's voice. For the listener, who listens in the snow and nothing himself, beholds nothing that is not there and the nothing that is. Tommy read, stumbling slightly over the unfamiliar words. He looked up at Thunderbolt. I'm not sure what that means, but it sounds nice, doesn't it? The horse nickered softly in response. Tommy continued reading until the light faded, then closed the book and simply sat in companionable silence. On the 30th day, Tommy arrived to find Thunderbolt unusually restless, pacing his stall and occasionally pawing at the ground. Something wrong, boy? Tommy asked, approaching cautiously. The horse snorted, tossing his head. Tommy noticed how the sleek black coat had begun to regain its natural shine under his daily grooming, except for one spot on the withers that Thunderbolt wouldn't allow him to touch. Let me see what's bothering you, Tommy murmured, easing the stall door open. Thunderbolt's ears flicked back and forth, but he didn't retreat. Keeping his movements slow and deliberate, Tommy extended his hand, palm up. The horse lowered his muzzle to sniff the familiar scent. That's it, Tommy encouraged. You know me. Inch by inch, he moved closer until his fingertips brushed against Thunderbolt's neck. The horse tensed but didn't pull away. For 5 miraculous seconds, Tommy's hand rested against the warm coat, feeling the powerful muscles beneath. Then Thunderbolt sidestepped, breaking the contact. But he remained close, allowing Tommy to exist in his space. A profound act of trust from an animal who had learned to fear human touch. That night at dinner, Mr. Pearson noticed Tommy's unusually bright expression. Good day with your horse? He let me touch him, Tommy said, unable to contain his excitement. Just for a few seconds, but he didn't pull away or get scared. Mrs. Pearson exchanged a look with her husband. Tommy, we've been meaning to talk to you about this situation. Tommy's smile faded. Here it came, the inevitable moment when they'd tell him it was too much, too dangerous, too impractical. Just like the other families had said about various pets, projects, or dreams. We're concerned about you biking those dark roads before dawn, Mrs. Pearson continued. So Mr. Pearson and I thought, if you're committed to this responsibility, perhaps we could drive you to the ranch before work 3 days a week. Tommy stared, speechless. Mr. Pearson cleared his throat. And I fixed up that old alarm clock in the garage. Figured you could use it since you're getting up so early. You're not going to make me give him up? Tommy asked, his voice small. Mrs. Pearson reached across the table to squeeze his hand. Honey, we've seen how dedicated you've been. Never complaining about the work or the early hours. That shows character. And Mrs. Wilson called us, Mr. Pearson added. Said you're the most reliable help she's had in years. Tommy felt a warmth spreading through his chest, unfamiliar, yet welcome. It wasn't quite belonging, not yet, but perhaps its precursor, being seen, being valued. Thank you, he managed, blinking rapidly. As days stretched into weeks, a rhythm developed. Every morning, Tommy arrived at the stable and played his harmonica for exactly 7 minutes. Thunderbolt seemed to enjoy the ritual, often standing with his head near the stall door, listening. Then Tommy would read aloud while cleaning the stall, discussing his school day, or explaining concepts from his homework as if the horse were another student. On the 45th day, a significant breakthrough occurred. Thunderbolt allowed Tommy to brush his mane for 5 full minutes, standing perfectly still as the brush worked through the tangled hair. Mrs. Wilson, watching from the doorway, whispered, Arthur would have called that horse magic. Word of Tommy's progress with the Montgomery problem horse began to spread through Louisville's close-knit equestrian community. One evening, a sleek black Cadillac pulled into Wilson Ranch. Harrison Montgomery himself emerged, accompanied by a sharp-featured man carrying a leather briefcase. Tommy was currying Thunderbolt when Mrs. Wilson appeared at the stall door, her expression tight. Montgomery's here, wants to talk to you. In the ranch's small kitchen, Harrison Montgomery looked out of place among the worn furniture and homey decorations. His tailored suit and manicured hands spoke of wealth that Mrs. Wilson's modest ranch had never known. Young man, Montgomery began without preamble. I'll be direct. I'm prepared to buy back Thunderbolt. Tommy felt his heart stutter. He's not for sale, sir. Montgomery's lawyer opened his briefcase, withdrawing a checkbook. We understand you've developed an attachment to the animal, but Mr. Montgomery is concerned about liability issues. Liability? Tommy repeated. Montgomery's smile didn't reach his eyes. That horse has a documented history of aggression. Should you get injured, your foster family might hold my breeding operation responsible since the animal originated from our stables. I won't get hurt, Tommy said firmly. Thunderbolt trusts me. $5,000, Montgomery stated, nodding to his lawyer, who began writing the check. Not because he's worth anything, but to prevent you from getting hurt and your foster family suing my stables. Tommy looked to Mrs. Wilson, who stood with arms crossed, silent disapproval radiating from her posture. Thank you, but no, Tommy said. He's not for sale at any price. Montgomery's pleasant facade cracked slightly, a flash of anger crossing his features. Everyone has a price, boy. You'll learn that. As the men prepared to leave, Montgomery paused at the door. That horse made me look incompetent. No one will believe a 12-year-old boy tamed what my best trainers couldn't. His voice hardened. Think carefully about my offer. It won't be repeated. After they departed, Mrs. Wilson placed a supportive hand on Tommy's shoulder. You stood your ground. Arthur would have been proud. News of Montgomery's visit spread quickly. The following day, Pete Simmons, the retired farrier who had transported Thunderbolt from the auction, appeared with a set of tools for maintaining the horse's prosthesis. Heard you might need these, he said gruffly, demonstrating how to check for wear points and make minor adjustments. Call me if anything needs serious work. 3 days later, Sarah Donovan, a riding instructor from a neighboring town, arrived with an old but well-maintained saddle. My father's, she explained. He believed in giving good equipment a second life with someone who will appreciate it. Most surprising was Sheriff Jackson's increasingly regular appearances for casual coffee with Mrs. Wilson on mornings when Montgomery's vehicles were spotted in the vicinity. The message was clear, if unspoken, the community was watching. That evening, as Tommy left the stable, he noticed something different in Thunderbolt's behavior. The horse followed him to the door, nickering softly when he prepared to leave, as if asking him to stay longer. At the same moment, headlights briefly illuminated the access road to the ranch, quickly disappearing when Tommy looked in that direction. The headlights vanished into the darkness, leaving Tommy with an uneasy feeling that persisted throughout his ride home. That night, rain began to fall over Louisville, a gentle patter that intensified into a downpour by morning. Tommy awoke before his alarm, listening to the water drumming against the roof. The thought of Thunderbolt alone in the storm made him dress even faster than usual. Take the raincoat, Mrs. Pearson called as he headed for the door. She stood in her bathrobe, a mug of coffee warming her hands. And be careful on those roads. They'll be slippery. Tommy nodded gratefully, pulling on the yellow slicker that Mr. Pearson had purchased for him after noticing his daily commute. The plastic material crinkled as he mounted his bicycle, the small flashlight cutting a weak beam through the pre-dawn darkness and sheets of rain. The 8-kilometer ride was treacherous. Twice Tommy's tires slid on slick pavement, forcing him to catch himself with a foot against the ground. By the time he turned onto Wilson Ranch's gravel drive, he was soaked from mid-thigh down, his sneakers squelching with every pedal push. Something felt wrong the moment he entered the barn. The usual morning quiet was broken by agitated movements from Thunderbolt's stall, the hollow sound of hooves striking wood, anxious nickering that verged on distress. Tommy dropped his backpack and rushed forward, rainwater dripping from his slicker. "What's wrong, boy?" he called, approaching the stall with caution. Thunderbolt paced in tight circles, his movements jerky and uncomfortable. When he saw Tommy, he tossed his head and whinnied sharply, ears flicking back and forth in obvious distress. Tommy noticed immediately how the horse favored his prosthetic leg, barely putting weight on it before shifting away with a pained movement. "Let me see," Tommy murmured, trying to keep his voice calm despite his rising concern. He observed from outside the stall, studying Thunderbolt's movements. The prosthetic itself appeared intact, but the point where it connected to the horse's leg showed angry redness. Even from a distance, Tommy could see swelling around the attachment site. Thunderbolt pawed the ground anxiously, his dark eyes rolling to show the whites, a clear sign of pain. Tommy reached for his phone to call the veterinarian, only to discover the battery had died, likely from the moisture of his rain-soaked pocket. He hurried to the house, where Mrs. Wilson was just emerging onto her porch with a steaming mug. "Something's wrong with Thunderbolt's leg," Tommy explained breathlessly. "The prosthetic is bothering him." Mrs. Wilson set down her mug. "I'll call Dr. Matthews." 5 minutes later, she returned with a grim expression. "He's at an emergency call. Colicking horse out in Fairfield. Won't be available until tomorrow at earliest." "Tomorrow?" Tommy's voice cracked. "But Thunderbolt's in pain now." Mrs. Wilson handed him a towel for his dripping hair. "Let me see him." They returned to the barn together, finding Thunderbolt even more agitated than before. The horse now refused to put any weight on the prosthetic, keeping the limb raised slightly off the ground. "That connection point is inflamed," Mrs. Wilson observed. "Could be rubbing wrong, or maybe a fastener's loose. Hard to tell without getting close." "What can we do?" Tommy asked, watching Thunderbolt's labored movements with growing distress. Mrs. Wilson sighed heavily. "Not much without a vet. Keep him calm, make sure he has water. Maybe try cold compresses if he'll let you near him, which I doubt in this state." She placed a firm hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Listen to me, Tommy. Don't go into that stall alone, no matter what happens. An animal in pain is unpredictable, even one that trusts you. We'll wait for Dr. Matthews." Tommy nodded reluctantly, understanding the wisdom in her words. But as the morning progressed, Thunderbolt's distress intensified. The horse refused feed and water, focusing entirely on his discomfort. Each pained movement, each distressed whinny, felt like a physical blow to Tommy's heart. By mid-morning, rain still pelting the barn roof, Tommy made his decision. He couldn't watch Thunderbolt suffer until tomorrow. Something needed to be done now. He remembered Pete Simmons showing him how the prosthetic attached, pointing out the adjustment points and fasteners. "Sometimes they just need a minor tweak," the retired farrier had explained. "Like breaking in a new pair of boots." Tommy gathered the tools Pete had left, a specialized wrench, some padding material, and antiseptic ointment. He stood outside the stall, watching Thunderbolt's movements carefully, trying to pinpoint the exact source of discomfort. After several minutes of observation, he noticed a pattern. Whenever Thunderbolt shifted his weight onto the prosthetic, he flinched slightly at the same point, where a metal fastener connected to the upper portion of the device. Looking closer, Tommy could see that the fastener appeared slightly askew. "I think I see the problem," he murmured, more to himself than to the horse. The moment of decision arrived. Tommy took a deep breath, remembering Mrs. Wilson's warning. Don't go into that stall alone. But he also remembered the way Thunderbolt had begun to trust him, how the horse had sought his presence just yesterday. "I'm coming in," Tommy said softly, his voice barely audible above the rain. "I'm going to help you." He began humming the melody his biological mother used to sing, one of his few memories from before the foster system. The song was simple, a lullaby about stars guiding travelers home. Tommy didn't remember all the words, but the tune had stayed with him, a fragment of belonging in a life defined by transience. As he hummed, he unlatched the stall door slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm despite his racing heart. Thunderbolt watched him with wary eyes, muscles tensed for flight or fight. The massive animal shifted his weight anxiously, the healthy hooves scraping against the straw bedding. "I know it hurts," Tommy continued in a low, gentle voice. "But I think I can fix it. You just need to trust me a little longer." He stepped fully into the stall, closing the door behind him, now committed to this course of action. Thunderbolt snorted, tossing his head, but didn't charge or retreat. Tommy kept humming, moving incrementally closer to the horse's side, never making direct eye contact, which could be perceived as a challenge. "Good boy," he murmured between notes of the lullaby. "Such a good, brave boy." The rain intensified, drumming against the roof in a crescendo that matched Tommy's heartbeat. He was now close enough to touch Thunderbolt, close enough to be struck if the horse panicked. The space within the stall seemed to shrink, highlighting the reality of his situation, a 12-year-old boy alone with a 1,000-pound animal in pain. A memory flashed through Tommy's mind, his third foster home, where Mr. Mitchell had shown him how to approach nervous dogs at the shelter where he volunteered. Animals can smell fear, he'd explained, but they can also sense when someone truly wants to help. The trick is believing it yourself. Tommy steadied his breathing, focusing entirely on Thunderbolt's need rather than his own fear. With infinite patience, he reached his hand toward the horse's shoulder, well away from the prosthetic. "I'm just going to touch you here first," he explained, as if Thunderbolt could understand every word. "Then I'll move down to check the fastener. It won't take long." His fingers made contact with the warm coat, feeling the tremors running through the powerful muscles beneath. Thunderbolt stiffened, but remained still. Taking this as permission, Tommy began a slow progression down the horse's side, keeping constant contact to avoid startling him with unexpected touches. When he finally reached the prosthetic, he had to kneel to examine the connection point properly. This position made him incredibly vulnerable. If Thunderbolt spooked now, Tommy would have no chance to escape a potential kick or trampling. "Almost there," he soothed, fingers carefully probing the device. "Just as I thought. This fastener's worked itself loose. It's rubbing against your skin with every step." The specialized wrench felt awkward in his small hands, but Tommy worked methodically, tightening the fastener with minute adjustments while continuously murmuring reassurances. The inflamed skin around the connection point was hot to the touch, evidence of how long Thunderbolt had been suffering in silence. "This might pinch for a second," Tommy warned as he made the final adjustment, "but then it should feel much better." When the fastener was properly secured, Tommy applied a thin layer of antiseptic ointment to the irritated skin. Throughout the procedure, Thunderbolt remained unnaturally still, as if understanding the necessity of the momentary discomfort. Job completed, Tommy slowly rose from his kneeling position, suddenly aware of his complete vulnerability. He stood inside the stall of a horse that had sent 3 professional handlers to the hospital, with no quick escape route, no protective equipment. If Thunderbolt chose this moment to express his pain or fear through aggression, Tommy had no defense. Time seemed suspended as boy and horse regarded each other in the rain-dimmed light of the stable. Tommy's heart pounded in his ears, almost drowning out the sound of the downpour. He had done what he came to do. Now he needed to exit safely. "All finished," he said softly, beginning to edge toward the stall door. "You should feel better now." What happened next would remain etched in Tommy's memory forever. Thunderbolt, the horse everyone had given up on, lowered his head until it rested gently against Tommy's shoulder. The massive animal leaned slightly into the boy, not enough to knock him over, but enough to convey something profound. Gratitude, perhaps, or simply acknowledgement of their shared moment of trust. Tommy stood perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The weight of Thunderbolt's head against his shoulder felt like the most precious burden he had ever carried. Tears welled in his eyes, blurring his vision. "You're welcome," he whispered. From the barn doorway came a small sound, a stifled gasp. Mrs. Wilson stood there, rain dripping from her raincoat, watching the tableau before her with glistening eyes. "I told you not to go in there alone," she said. But there was no anger in her voice, only wonder. "I had to help him," Tommy replied simply, still not moving from his position. Mrs. Wilson nodded slowly. "I know." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "Milagres ainda acontecem in Kentucky." Miracles still happen in Kentucky. When Tommy finished his chores that evening, Thunderbolt followed him to the stall door, standing comfortably on his adjusted prosthetic. The inflammation had already begun to subside, and the horse moved with noticeably more ease. Tommy gave him a final apple before preparing to leave. "See you tomorrow, buddy," he promised. The next morning, something extraordinary happened. When Tommy entered the barn, Thunderbolt batted his hoof 3 times rhythmically against the stall floor, exactly as racing horses were taught to signal readiness. When Tommy hesitantly brought out the saddle Sarah Donovan had given him, The horse remained perfectly still, as if he had been waiting for this moment since their first day together. Tommy stood transfixed, his hand resting on the leather saddle as Thunderbolt remained perfectly still. The morning light filtered through the barn windows, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air between them. Was this really happening? After weeks of patient work, the horse who had been deemed too dangerous to approach was now inviting him to ride. "Are you sure?" Tommy whispered, hardly daring to breathe. Thunderbolt's ears flicked forward at the sound of his voice, dark eyes fixed on the boy with an intelligence that sometimes made Tommy wonder how much the horse truly understood. The prosthetic leg gleamed in the sunlight, no longer a symbol of defeat, but a testament to resilience. With careful movements, Tommy approached the horse's side, saddle blanket in hand. He'd watched Sarah Donovan demonstrate the proper technique, but theory and practice were worlds apart. Thunderbolt remained motionless as Tommy placed the blanket, then the saddle, adjusting each with deliberate precision. "Good boy," Tommy murmured, his fingers working the cinch strap. "You're doing so well." When everything was secure, Tommy faced his next challenge, mounting a 16-hand thoroughbred for the first time. He led Thunderbolt to a large overturned bucket that Mrs. Wilson had provided as a mounting block. Even with this advantage, Tommy had to stretch to get his foot in the stirrup. He paused, one foot on the bucket, one in the stirrup, suddenly aware of how high off the ground he would be. "Here goes nothing," he whispered, and pushed himself upward. The world tilted momentarily as he swung his leg over, finding the opposite stirrup by instinct rather than skill. Then suddenly, he was seated atop Thunderbolt, higher than he'd ever been without climbing a tree. The horse shifted slightly, adjusting to his weight, but showed none of the panic or aggression that had defined their early interactions. "We did it," Tommy breathed, a smile spreading across his face. "We actually did it." Mrs. Wilson appeared in the barn doorway, coffee mug in hand, eyes widening at the sight before her. "Well, I'll be," she murmured, a smile crinkling the corners of her eyes. "Don't move. Let me get my camera. No one's going to believe this without proof." After the initial excitement of that first ride, which consisted mostly of walking careful circles in the small paddock behind the barn, Tommy and Thunderbolt began to explore the boundaries of Mrs. Wilson's property together. The horse moved with surprising grace despite his prosthetic, adapting his gait to maintain balance and comfort. Tommy marveled at this resilience, this determination to overcome what must have been a devastating injury for a former racehorse. On a crisp Saturday morning 3 weeks later, Tommy guided Thunderbolt along the fence line that separated Wilson Ranch from the neighboring properties. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke, and Thunderbolt's breath puffed visible clouds as they meandered along well-worn paths. As they approached the small creek that marked the property's eastern boundary, Tommy noticed an elderly man seated on a folding chair, fishing rod extended over the lazy water. The stranger looked up at their approach, his weathered face breaking into an expression of disbelief. "Lord above," the man exclaimed, setting his rod aside. "Is that Thunderbolt? The Montgomery Black?" Tommy reined in gently, keeping a respectful distance. "Yes, sir. Do you know him?" The man stood slowly, joints protesting audibly. "Know him? Boy, I helped raise him from a foal." He approached cautiously, eyes fixed on Thunderbolt. "Bill Johnson. I was head groom at Montgomery Farms for 32 years before my retirement." Thunderbolt's ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he caught the man's scent. There was recognition there, but not fear, a promising sign. "I'm Tommy Reynolds," the boy introduced himself. "I bought Thunderbolt at the auction a couple months ago." Bill's bushy eyebrows shot upward. "You bought him? I thought they'd put him down after the accident. That's what happens to most of Harrison's problems." He shook his head in wonder. "And he lets you ride him?" "That Black Lightning was always high-spirited, but after they pushed him too hard—" "Black Lightning?" Tommy asked, confused. "That was his barn name before they registered him as Thunderbolt," Bill explained. "Fastest 2-year-old I ever saw. Had heart like you wouldn't believe." A shadow crossed his face. But Harrison always wanted more. More speed, more wins, more glory for the Montgomery name. Tommy slid carefully from the saddle, sensing a story that deserved his full attention. What happened to him? Before the accident, I mean. Bill settled back onto his chair, gesturing for Tommy to join him on a nearby log. Thunderbolt grazed contentedly nearby, seemingly comfortable in the old groom's presence. That Garagnon had champion written all over him from day one, Bill began, his voice taking on the cadence of a natural storyteller. But Harrison, he's not like his daddy was. Old Mr. Montgomery understood horses needed time, needed care. Young Harrison only understands numbers, times, speeds, purses. The old man's eyes grew distant, revisiting memories. About 3 years back, Thunderbolt was training for the Derby. Everyone knew he had a shot at the Roses. But 2 weeks before the race, he pulled up lame after a workout. Nothing serious, just needed rest. The vet ordered 2 weeks off, no exceptions. Tommy's stomach tightened, already sensing where this story was heading. Harrison fired that vet the same day, Bill continued, his voice hardening. Brought in some young fellow who'd sign whatever he was told to sign. They kept training Thunderbolt, even with that injury. I tried to speak up, but he shrugged helplessly. Next thing I know, I'm retired, with a month's severance and a cheap watch. And the accident? Tommy prompted quietly. Happened during a stakes race at Churchill Downs. That leg had been weakening for weeks, when it finally gave out at full gallop. Bill winced at the memory. Never seen anything like it. Jockey was lucky to walk away. As for Thunderbolt, most owners would have had him put down on the spot, but Harrison had just invested in some experimental veterinary program. Good publicity, saving the horse. But once the cameras were gone, he reached a gnarled hand toward Thunderbolt, who lowered his head to sniff the familiar scent. They kept him locked away after the prosthetic surgery. Minimal care, minimal interaction. An animal like this, born to run, born to connect, treated like a shameful secret. Bill's eyes grew moist. No wonder he turned mean. Wasn't his fault. Tommy absorbed this information like physical blows, each detail adding to the weight in his chest. He's different now, he offered, getting better every day. Bill nodded slowly. I can see that. There's peace in his eyes I haven't seen since he was a colt. He studied Tommy with newfound respect. Whatever you're doing, son, keep doing it. You've accomplished what none of Montgomery's high-priced trainers could. As they rode back to the barn, Tommy felt a new determination solidifying within him. Thunderbolt's issues weren't innate. They were the product of human cruelty and neglect. Understanding the horse's past didn't excuse the dangerous behaviors, but it explained them. And explanation was the first step toward healing. Monday morning at Oakwood Middle School brought an unwelcome reminder that not all battles were being won. As Tommy retrieved books from his locker, a familiar voice cut through the hallway noise. Hey, Foster Freak. Heard you've been playing Horse Whisperer. Brad Montgomery leaned against the adjacent locker, flanked by 2 football teammates whose names Tommy had never bothered to learn. Brad's designer clothes and perfectly styled hair seemed designed to emphasize the contrast between them. The heir to a racing empire and the orphan who dared to intrude on that world. Leave me alone, Brad, Tommy said quietly, trying to close his locker. Brad slammed it shut, nearly catching Tommy's fingers. My dad says you've lost your mind trying to ride that psycho horse. He almost killed Miguel, our best trainer, before he broke his leg. Tommy felt anger rising in his chest. He's not psycho. He was scared and hurt. There's a difference. Oh, the horse expert speaks, Brad mocked, drawing laughs from his companions. What would a nobody like you know about thoroughbreds? My family's been breeding champions since my great-grandfather's time. And treating them like machines instead of living creatures, Tommy retorted before he could stop himself. Brad's face darkened. He shoved Tommy hard against the lockers, metal edges digging into his back. My father says that horse is going to kill you. Maybe it would be doing everyone a favor. One less burden on the foster system. The words struck deeper than the physical blow. Tommy had heard variations of this sentiment before, that his existence was a burden, a problem to be managed rather than a life to be nurtured. Before he could respond, A teacher's voice cut through the confrontation. "What's going on here, gentlemen?" Mr. Collins, the science teacher, approached with a stern expression. "Just catching up with my friend Tommy," Brad replied smoothly, releasing his grip and stepping back. Mr. Collins looked skeptical but merely said, "Bell's about to ring. I suggest you all get to class." As Brad and his friends sauntered away, Brad called over his shoulder, "That horse is crazy. He almost killed our best trainer before breaking his leg." For the rest of the day, Tommy found himself distracted, replaying Brad's words and Bill Johnson's revelations. The two narratives created a fuller picture of Thunderbolt's journey, from promising champion to discarded problem, all because of human greed and impatience. That evening, as dusk settled over Wilson Ranch, Mrs. Wilson invited Tommy to join her on the porch after he finished his chores. She had an old photo album spread across her lap, its leather cover cracked with age. "Thought you might like to see these," she said, patting the space beside her on the swing. Tommy sat down, immediately drawn to the black and white photographs spread before him. They showed a younger Mrs. Wilson alongside a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a horseman's weathered complexion. "That's my Arthur," she said, touching one image with gentle fingers. "Finest horseman in 3 counties, though he'd never have claimed so himself." She turned the page to reveal Arthur standing beside a magnificent chestnut horse. "That's Secretariat," she said with quiet pride. "The greatest of them all. Arthur was a groom at Churchill Downs back then." Tommy stared in awe at the photograph connecting his hero poster to a real person who had known the legendary racehorse. "What was he like? Secretariat, I mean." Arthur always said he had the biggest heart, literally and figuratively. When they performed the autopsy, they found his heart was nearly twice the size of a normal horse's. She turned another page. But what Arthur valued most wasn't just physical gifts. He always said that force can make a horse obey, but only respect can make a horse want to run for you. As the evening deepened into night, Mrs. Wilson shared stories of her late husband's approach to troubled horses, his patience, his gentle but firm consistency, his belief that every animal deserved to be seen as an individual rather than a commodity. "You remind me of him," she said as Tommy prepared to leave. "Same quiet way of listening, same respect for the animal's dignity." That night, Tommy returned to the Pearsons' house with his mind swirling with new information and perspectives. He spent hours poring over library books about equine rehabilitation, falling asleep with The Principles of Horse Training open across his chest. In the following days, Tommy began to implement some of Arthur Wilson's methods, as interpreted through his widow's stories. He read aloud to Thunderbolt from his textbooks beneath the ancient oak tree in Mrs. Wilson's pasture, the horse eventually lying down beside him in an extraordinary display of trust. "You know, Tommy," Mrs. Wilson remarked one afternoon as she watched their interaction from a distance, "my Arthur could see the soul of a horse. You have that same gift." When Tommy returned home that evening, he found the Pearsons sitting at the kitchen table with unusually serious expressions. Mrs. Pearson spoke first, her voice carefully neutral. "Tommy, we received a call today from social services. Someone made an anonymous complaint questioning whether it's appropriate for a child in foster care to be handling a dangerous animal without proper supervision. They're sending someone to evaluate the situation next week." Tommy stared at the Pearsons, his throat suddenly dry. "Someone complained about Thunderbolt?" Mrs. Pearson nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "They didn't identify themselves, but the timing seems purposeful." "It was Montgomery, wasn't it?" Tommy said, the realization settling like a stone in his stomach. Mr. Pearson exchanged a glance with his wife. "We can't know for certain, but it wouldn't surprise me. Men like Harrison Montgomery are used to getting their way." Tommy's mind raced through the implications. If social services deemed Thunderbolt dangerous, they could force him to give up the horse. Or worse, determine that the Pearsons weren't providing adequate supervision, which could mean yet another displacement for Tommy. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice smaller than he intended. "A woman named Mrs. Jenkins will visit next week," Mrs. Pearson explained. She'll evaluate the situation, talk to us, to you, possibly visit the ranch to see Thunderbolt. She's just doing her job, Tommy, Mr. Pearson added, noticing the boy's darkening expression. Her concern is your safety, which is something we care about too. Tommy nodded automatically, though inside he felt the familiar walls building, the protective instinct that had helped him survive 7 different foster homes. Don't get attached. Prepare for loss. Expect disappointment. May I be excused? He asked quietly. I have homework. In his room, Tommy didn't touch his backpack. Instead, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the Secretariat poster, as if it might offer some solution. The thought of losing Thunderbolt made it difficult to breathe, a physical ache spreading through his chest. In just 2 months, the horse had become the center of his world, the first living being that seemed to need Tommy as much as Tommy needed him. The next morning, Tommy arrived at Wilson Ranch earlier than usual, desperate to maximize his time with Thunderbolt. He found Mrs. Wilson at her kitchen table, an opened letter spread before her, her normally composed face etched with worry. "What's wrong?" Tommy asked, immediately sensing trouble. She glanced up, momentarily startled by his presence. "Oh, Tommy. Didn't hear you come in." She folded the letter with deliberate movements. "Nothing for you to worry about." But Tommy had already glimpsed the letterhead. "That's from Riverside Bank." Mrs. Wilson sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Just some paperwork about my mortgage. Nothing important." Tommy remained in the doorway, unconvinced. Mrs. Wilson had never been anything but forthright with him. Her evasiveness now spoke volumes. "Please tell me," he said. "Is it because of me and Thunderbolt?" After a long moment, she nodded reluctantly. "The bank is suddenly re-evaluating my mortgage terms. A mortgage that was nearly paid off after 30 years of on-time payments." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "The loan officer mentioned in passing how unfortunate it would be if I lost my property to Montgomery Estates, which has been trying to buy this land for years." Tommy felt sick. "This is my fault. Montgomery's trying to punish you for helping me." "Now you listen to me, Thomas Reynolds," Mrs. Wilson said firmly, rising from her chair. "I've been standing up to bullies like Harrison Montgomery my entire life. Arthur and I fought them together, and I'll keep fighting them alone." Her eyes softened. Or not so alone anymore, it seems. Tommy helped Mrs. Wilson with the morning chores, his mind churning with guilt and determination. As he filled water buckets, the ranch's phone rang. Through the open barn door, he could see Mrs. Wilson answer it in the kitchen. Her expression gradually tightened as she listened, and when she hung up, she stared out the window for a long moment before coming to find Tommy. "That was Dr. Matthews," she said. "3 of his biggest clients canceled their appointments this week, all Montgomery associates. He's trying to hurt everyone who helps us," Tommy said, the realization turning his voice hollow. Mrs. Wilson nodded grimly. "He's trying to isolate Thunderbolt, isolate all of us." That afternoon, as Tommy groomed Thunderbolt in the autumn sunshine, he noticed a cloud of dust approaching on the access road. A camouflage-painted Jeep roared up the drive, country music blaring from its speakers. Tommy's stomach dropped when he recognized Brad Montgomery behind the wheel, 2 of his ever-present entourage beside him. "Keep Thunderbolt calm," Mrs. Wilson instructed, appearing beside Tommy as if summoned by the disturbance. "I'll handle this." But Brad and his friends didn't approach the house. Instead, they parked near the fence line where Thunderbolt was grazing, just far enough away to be on public property, but close enough to cause trouble. "Hey, Foster Freak," Brad called, climbing onto the Jeep's hood for a better view. "Brought some friends to see the famous zombie horse." Tommy set down his grooming brush. "Stay here," he told Mrs. Wilson, walking toward the fence with measured steps. "Brad, please leave," he called, keeping his voice steady despite the anger building in his chest. "You're trespassing." "Public road," Brad countered with a smirk, pointing to the gravel shoulder where they'd parked. "Free country." One of Brad's friends produced a long stick from the Jeep's back seat. With a laugh, he extended it toward the fence, poking it through the rails toward where Thunderbolt grazed. "See if he's still crazy," Brad encouraged, filming with his cell phone. My dad says once a horse goes bad, it never comes back. The stick jabbed toward Thunderbolt, not quite reaching him but close enough to catch his attention. The horse's head came up sharply, ears flattening as he backed away from the fence. "Stop it!" Tommy shouted, breaking into a run. "You'll scare him." "That's the point, genius," Brad's other friend called, grabbing another stick and joining in the torment. Thunderbolt's peaceful grazing transformed into agitated pacing. The horse snorted, eyes rolling to show the whites, a danger sign Tommy had learned to recognize. The prosthetic leg thumped against the ground as Thunderbolt's movements grew more erratic. Tommy reached the fence, desperately trying to place himself between the sticks and his horse. "Stop! He's been through enough." Brad zoomed in with his phone camera, narrating, "Foster boy defending his broken horse. Let's see how that works out." As Tommy tried to wave away the poking sticks, Brad jumped down from the Jeep's hood and approached. With a sudden movement, he shoved Tommy hard, sending him sprawling into the mud from recent rain. "My dad says people like you need to learn their place," Brad sneered, filming Tommy's humiliation. A crippled horse for a nobody. From the corner of his eye, Tommy could see Thunderbolt watching the confrontation. The horse was clearly agitated, but remained on the far side of the paddock, as if understanding the danger of reacting. This restraint, this awareness, only made Tommy's heart ache more for what Thunderbolt must have endured in his past. "You don't know anything about him," Tommy said, rising from the mud, his voice stronger than he expected. "Or about me." Brad's smile faltered slightly at Tommy's calm defiance. He glanced at his friends, then back at his phone, ensuring he was still recording. "Whatever, freak. Enjoy your quality time before that horse kills you, or they ship you to another foster home. My dad says it's just a matter of time." The boys eventually tired of their game when neither Tommy nor Thunderbolt provided the dramatic reaction they'd hoped for. As the Jeep roared away, Mrs. Wilson approached with a towel for Tommy's mud-covered clothes. "You handled that well," she said. "Better than I would have at your age." That evening, sitting at Mrs. Wilson's kitchen table with a mug of hot chocolate, Tommy felt the full weight of the day's events. "Maybe I should give him up," he said quietly, staring into his mug. "I'm causing problems for you, for the Pearsons, for Dr. Matthews." Mrs. Wilson set down her own mug with a decisive click. "Now you listen to me, young man. You are not causing these problems. Harrison Montgomery is, because he can't stand the thought of being wrong." She rose and walked to a small cabinet, returning with a framed photograph that she placed carefully before Tommy. It showed a younger version of her husband standing proudly beside a chestnut horse. Arthur was a groom in Churchill Downs when that picture was taken. In 1978, a horse called Affirmed won the Triple Crown. Know who believed in him when everyone said he was too small? Arthur. Her eyes took on a faraway look. Some people are born to recognize greatness, where others see only defects. Tommy studied the photograph, noting the same quiet confidence in Arthur's expression that he sometimes glimpsed in his widow's face. "What would Arthur do now?" he asked. Mrs. Wilson smiled. "He'd say that backing down from bullies only teaches them that bullying works." The next morning, Tommy arrived at school to find an unusual buzz of activity. As he walked through the hallways, he noticed other students looking at him, not with the usual indifference or occasional derision, but with a strange new interest. In his first class, the whispers were impossible to ignore. "Is it true?" Melissa Carter, a quiet girl who had never spoken to him before, asked as they waited for their teacher. "About your horse and the Montgomery kid?" Tommy frowned, confused. "What about them?" "The video," she explained, looking surprised that he didn't know. "Brad posted it online last night, trying to make you look bad, but..." She shrugged. "It kind of did the opposite." By lunchtime, Tommy had heard from multiple sources about Brad's video. Far from portraying Tommy as pathetic, the footage showed a boy defending a traumatized animal against senseless cruelty, and Brad didn't come off well at all. As Tommy sat alone at his usual lunch table, Sheriff Jackson's son, Michael, unexpectedly sat down across from him. "Dad wanted me to tell you he's stopping by the ranch this afternoon. Says he has news." True to his word, Sheriff Jackson arrived at Wilson Ranch just as Tommy was finishing his after-school chores. The sheriff's expression was serious but satisfied as he accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Wilson. "Thought you should know," he began, looking at Tommy. "That video young Montgomery posted has generated quite a reaction in town. People are asking questions, not just about yesterday's incident, but about how Montgomery Farms treats their animals in general." He sipped his coffee before continuing. "And that led my office to look into some other complaints that had been, let's say, insufficiently investigated in the past. Turns out there's a pattern of problem horses at Montgomery Farms that mysteriously disappear." Tommy's eyes widened, like what Bill Johnson told me about. The sheriff nodded. "Exactly like that. We've opened a discreet investigation based on anonymous tips that have suddenly started pouring in. Seems Montgomery's iron grip on this community might be loosening." Before leaving, Sheriff Jackson added one more piece of news. "The festival committee is under pressure to reconsider their decision about your participation. Seems the public doesn't appreciate a 12-year-old boy being bullied by the most powerful man in the county." When Tommy arrived at school the next morning, he stopped in his tracks at the entrance. At least 24 students were wearing homemade t-shirts with the phrase, "Let Thunderbolt Run," scrawled in marker. Among them, incredibly, stood Brad Montgomery, looking uncomfortable but present, as if something fundamental had shifted overnight. Tommy stood frozen at the school entrance, staring at the sight before him. At least 24 students wearing homemade "Let Thunderbolt Run" t-shirts had gathered, and among them, looking uncomfortable but undeniably present, stood Brad Montgomery. Their eyes met across the crowded hallway, Brad's quickly darting away as a flush crept up his neck. Before Tommy could process this unexpected development, Sarah Donovan approached him with a bright smile. Her riding boots clicked against the linoleum floor as she navigated through the clusters of students. "Tommy, just the person I wanted to see," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority that made her such an effective riding instructor. "Do you have a moment?" Still distracted by Brad's presence, Tommy nodded automatically. "I wanted to show you this," Sarah continued, unfolding a colorful flyer. "The Kentucky Horse Festival is coming up in 3 weeks. They've added a new juvenile category this year for beginning riders. I think you and Thunderbolt should consider entering." Tommy blinked, focusing on the glossy paper in her hands. The festival was legendary in Kentucky's equestrian circles, a celebration of horsemanship featuring competitions, exhibitions, and demonstrations from the finest riders and horses in the state. "Me? At the Kentucky Horse Festival?" Tommy's voice cracked slightly. "But we're nowhere near that level. Thunderbolt's just learning to trust me, and I'm barely learning to ride." Sarah's expression softened. "It's not about winning, Tommy. It's about showing the world what you two have accomplished together. The juvenile category is designed for young riders who are just starting out." She paused, her voice lowering. "And frankly, your story deserves to be seen. People need to witness what's possible when someone believes in an animal that everyone else gave up on." Tommy studied the application form at the bottom of the flyer. The entry fee was modest, and the requirements for the juvenile division seemed basic, demonstrating simple walk-trot patterns, a few low jumps, and general horsemanship skills. "I'll think about it," he promised, carefully folding the paper into his backpack. That afternoon at Wilson Ranch, Tommy shared the flyer with Mrs. Wilson. They sat on the porch swing, the paper between them as autumn leaves spiraled down from the massive oak tree in the yard. "What do you think?" Tommy asked. "Would it be crazy to enter?" Mrs. Wilson studied the flyer with a thoughtful expression. "Not crazy at all. Might be good for both of you to have a goal to work toward." She tapped the paper with one weathered finger. "This juvenile category is perfect. No pressure, just a chance to show what you've learned together." By evening, Tommy had made his decision. He carefully filled out the application form, his handwriting unusually neat as he wrote "Thomas Reynolds and Thunderbolt" in the entrant field. Mrs. Wilson helped him address the envelope and found a stamp in her desk drawer. "There," she said as Tommy sealed the envelope. "Whatever happens, you've taken the first step." 3 days later, Tommy was grooming Thunderbolt when an unfamiliar car pulled into the ranch's driveway. A tall man in an expensive suit emerged, his polished shoes looking out of place on the gravel drive. "Can I help you?" Tommy called, setting down his brush. "Thomas Reynolds? I'm Richard Holbrook, director of the Kentucky Horse Festival." The man's handshake was firm, his smile professional but not quite reaching his eyes. "I received your application for the juvenile division." Tommy nodded, suddenly nervous. "Yes, sir. Is there a problem with it?" Holbrook glanced toward Thunderbolt, who watched the stranger with wary attention from behind the paddock fence. "I'm afraid I've come to explain why we need to decline your entry." He cleared his throat. "There are safety considerations that make it impossible for us to accept a horse with a prosthetic limb in our competition." Tommy felt his chest tighten. "But the prosthetic is completely secure. Dr. Matthews checks it regularly, and Thunderbolt has adapted perfectly. He can do everything other horses can." "I'm sure that's true," Holbrook replied, his discomfort becoming more evident. "But our insurance policies have strict guidelines about modified equipment and potential liability issues." From the farmhouse doorway came Mrs. Wilson's voice, firm and clear. "And when did these guidelines suddenly become an issue, Richard? Because Arthur served on your committee for 15 years, and I don't recall any such policies." Holbrook shifted his weight, avoiding Mrs. Wilson's piercing gaze. "Martha, you know how these things work. Times change, regulations tighten. Or perhaps certain sponsors threaten to withdraw their support?" Mrs. Wilson suggested, descending the porch steps to join them. Before Holbrook could respond, Sarah Donovan's truck roared up the driveway, dust billowing behind it. She jumped out, her usually composed face flushed with anger. "I just heard," she said, striding toward them. "Richard, this is absolutely unconscionable." Holbrook held up his hands defensively. "Sarah, this isn't personal. It's a liability issue." "Don't," Sarah cut him off sharply. "Don't insult my intelligence. I've known you for 20 years, Richard. This has Montgomery written all over it." The festival director's silence confirmed her accusation more effectively than words could have. After an uncomfortable moment, he sighed heavily. "I have a responsibility to ensure the festival's continued operation. Without our primary sponsors—" "You mean without Harrison Montgomery's money?" Sarah interrupted. "Be honest at least." Later that evening, after Holbrook had departed and Mrs. Wilson had returned to the house, Sarah stayed behind to help Tommy with Thunderbolt's evening routine. As they measured out feed together, she finally explained what had happened. "Harrison Montgomery threatened to withdraw all sponsorship if you and Thunderbolt were allowed to participate," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "He's the festival's biggest financial supporter, has been for decades. Without his money, they'd have to scale back dramatically." Tommy absorbed this information silently, pouring grain into Thunderbolt's bucket. "But why? We wouldn't have won anything. We're not a threat to his fancy horses." Sarah leaned against the feed room doorway. "It's not about winning, Tommy. It's about being seen." She crossed her arms, studying him with a thoughtful expression. "Harrison doesn't want anyone to see that a 12-year-old boy succeeded where his expensive trainers failed. And honestly, I think he's afraid you actually might do well. Thunderbolt was extraordinary before his accident." As Tommy processed her words, a new understanding crystallized. This wasn't just about a horse anymore. This was about power, about who got to decide which stories were told and which were silenced. The next morning, Tommy noticed something different as he entered his classroom. Mrs. Rodriguez was writing on the whiteboard, and when she turned around, he spotted a small pin on her lapel bearing the words, "Let Thunderbolt run." "Good morning, Tommy," she said with a warm smile. "I heard about what happened with the festival. Completely ridiculous, if you ask me." Throughout the day, Tommy noticed more pins, more whispers of support. In the cafeteria, the lunch lady slipped an extra cookie onto his tray with a conspiratorial wink. By his last class, he'd counted 7 teachers and at least 30 students wearing either pins or the homemade t-shirts. When the final bell rang, Tommy headed for his bicycle, only to find Brad Montgomery leaning against the bike rack. For a moment, Tommy considered walking away, but something in Brad's posture, less arrogant, more uncertain, made him approach. "Hey," Brad said awkwardly as Tommy unlocked his bike. "Hey," Tommy replied cautiously. Brad shifted his weight, looking everywhere but at Tommy's face. "My dad's being a jerk about the festival. Just wanted you to know not everyone named Montgomery thinks that way." Before Tommy could respond, Brad thrust a folded piece of paper into his hand and walked quickly away, shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. Tommy unfolded the note once Brad had disappeared around the corner. It contained just 3 lines. "Dad has a private meeting with the festival board tomorrow. He's bringing a document that proves Thunderbolt is too dangerous for public events. I know where he keeps the file and what really happened the day of the accident." That evening at the Pearsons' dinner table, Tommy was uncharacteristically quiet, pushing food around his plate as he considered Brad's note. Should he trust someone who had bullied him relentlessly? Could this be another trap? "Tommy?" Mrs. Pearson's voice broke through his thoughts. "Is everything all right? You've barely touched your chicken pot pie." "Just thinking about the festival," Tommy admitted, setting down his fork. "They rejected my application because of Thunderbolt's prosthetic. But everyone knows it's really because Mr. Montgomery threatened to pull his sponsorship." Mr. Pearson frowned. "That doesn't seem right. Competitions should be about merit, not money." "Sarah says the festival can't survive without his funding," Tommy explained. "And now everyone's getting involved. There are petitions online and kids at school are wearing t-shirts, and even Brad Montgomery is acting weird." "Brad?" Mrs. Pearson inquired. "The boy who pushed you?" Tommy nodded, still uncertain whether to mention the note. "He told me his dad is wrong about the festival. It was strange." Later that night, lying in bed beneath the Secretariat poster, Tommy made his decision. He would meet with Brad tomorrow and hear what he had to say. If there was even a chance of learning the truth about Thunderbolt's accident, a truth that might change the festival board's decision, he had to take it. The next morning, Tommy found Brad waiting in the empty band room before first period, his usual confident swagger replaced by nervous pacing. "You came," Brad said, sounding relieved. "What's this about?" Tommy asked, keeping his distance. "What do you know about Thunderbolt's accident?" Brad glanced toward the door, then lowered his voice. "My dad keeps files on all his horses, medical records, training notes, everything. After that video I posted went viral, I started thinking about some things I'd overheard." He swallowed hard. "So I went into his office and found Thunderbolt's file." He pulled a flash drive from his pocket. "I copied everything. The original accident report says Thunderbolt had been showing signs of lameness for weeks before the race where he broke down. 3 different vets recommended rest, but my dad kept pushing." Brad's voice cracked slightly. "The final vet who cleared him to race was hired the same day the previous one was fired." Tommy stared at the small device. "Why are you telling me this? Why now?" Brad's answer came slowly, as if he was still figuring it out himself. "That day at the ranch, when I pushed you, Thunderbolt could have charged the fence, could have gone crazy like all my dad's trainers said he would. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching, like he was protecting you." He met Tommy's eyes briefly. "Made me wonder what else my dad lied about." When Brad was about to leave, he hesitated, then turned back to Tommy. "My dad has a meeting with the festival board tomorrow. He's going to present a document that proves Thunderbolt is too dangerous for public events. But I know where he keeps that file, and I know what really happened the day of the accident." Tommy stared at the flash drive in his hand as Brad's footsteps faded down the hallway. The small device felt impossibly heavy, weighted with the truth about Thunderbolt's past. He slipped it into his pocket just as the first bell rang, signaling 5 minutes until classes began. Throughout the school day, the flash drive seemed to burn in his pocket, a constant reminder of the choice before him. By the time the final bell rang, Tommy had made his decision. This wasn't just about a horse competition anymore. It was about justice for Thunderbolt and all the other animals who had suffered in silence. Instead of heading directly to Wilson Ranch after school, Tommy made a detour to the sheriff's office, The small brick building sat on Main Street, its windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Sheriff Jackson looked up from his paperwork as Tommy entered, a knowing expression crossing his weathered face. "Figured you might stop by today," the sheriff said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. "Michael mentioned Brad Montgomery was acting strange at school." Tommy carefully placed the flash drive on the desk. "Brad gave me this. It's evidence about what really happened to Thunderbolt and other horses at Montgomery Farms." Sheriff Jackson picked up the small device, turning it thoughtfully between his fingers. "And you trust this information? Could be a trap." "I don't trust Brad," Tommy admitted, "but I believe he's telling the truth about this. Something changed after he posted that video. I think he's seeing his father differently now." The sheriff nodded slowly and inserted the flash drive into his computer. As files populated the screen, his expression grew increasingly grave. Tommy watched as he opened document after document, veterinary reports with conflicting assessments, internal memos about managing problem horses, photographs of facilities hidden from public tours. "This is negligence at best," Sheriff Jackson muttered, clicking through the evidence. "Criminal at worst." One document in particular caught Tommy's attention, a veterinary report dated 3 days before Thunderbolt's catastrophic breakdown. The assessment was clear and direct. Subject showing clear signs of tendon inflammation in right hind leg. Recommend immediate rest period of minimum 30 days. Racing at this stage would risk catastrophic injury. Below it was a termination notice for the veterinarian who had filed the report, dated the same day. "He fired the vet who tried to protect Thunderbolt," Tommy said quietly, his throat tight with anger. Sheriff Jackson nodded grimly, and replaced him with someone who'd sign off on whatever Montgomery wanted. He continued scrolling through files, stopping at a spreadsheet labeled Asset Management. It contained a list of 7 horses, all categorized as unsuitable for program and marked as decommissioned over the past 5 years. "Decommissioned," the sheriff repeated, his voice hard. "That's a cold way to describe getting rid of living creatures." He reached for his phone, punching in a number with deliberate precision. "Janet, get me the county prosecutor. Tell her it's about Montgomery Farms." He glanced at Tommy. "And we'll need a warrant to investigate the facilities. Tell her I have documentary evidence of systematic animal abuse." As Sheriff Jackson spoke with the prosecutor, Tommy felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread. This was what Thunderbolt deserved. Justice for what had been done to him. But he also knew that Harrison Montgomery would not go down without a fight, and the man had already demonstrated his willingness to use his power against anyone who challenged him. By the time Tommy arrived at Wilson Ranch an hour later, news of the investigation was already spreading. Mrs. Wilson met him at the barn door, her eyes bright with cautious hope. "Sheriff Jackson called," she said. "Said you brought him some important evidence." Tommy nodded, heading directly to Thunderbolt's stall. The horse greeted him with a soft nicker, extending his muzzle for the customary apple. As Tommy fed him the treat, he noticed how much Thunderbolt had changed over the past months. His coat now gleamed with health, his eyes clear and attentive rather than clouded with fear and pain. "Your past is finally catching up to the people who hurt you," Tommy murmured, stroking the horse's neck. "But I'm worried about what happens next." The following morning brought news that confirmed Tommy's fears. Officials had arrived at Montgomery Farms with a search warrant, confiscating computers and documents while interviewing staff members. Local news vans gathered outside the main entrance, capturing footage of somber-faced investigators carrying boxes of evidence. At school, Tommy found Ms. Parker waiting by his locker, a tablet in her hands. "Have you seen this?" she asked, showing him a web page. It was the online petition his teacher had started, now displaying more than 10,000 signatures beneath the headline, "Let Thunderbolt Run. Stop Bullying by Kentucky Horse Festival Sponsors." 10,000 people? Tommy whispered, staring at the number in disbelief. Ms. Parker nodded, her eyes sparkling. It went viral overnight after news broke about the investigation. People are connecting the dots, Montgomery's treatment of his horses and his attempt to block your participation in the festival. That afternoon, Sarah Donovan arrived at Wilson Ranch with surprising news. "The festival board called an emergency meeting this morning," she announced, joining Tommy and Mrs. Wilson in the barn aisle. "They voted to allow Thunderbolt's participation under the responsibility of the organizers." Richard Holbrook looked like he'd swallowed a lemon when he had to announce it. Mrs. Wilson chuckled. "I imagine Harrison didn't take that well." "He wasn't there," Sarah replied significantly. "First board meeting he's missed in 15 years. Later that evening, as dusk settled over the ranch, Tommy was finishing Thunderbolt's evening feeding when he heard the distinctive crunch of tires on gravel. Through the barn door, he saw a black Lincoln Town car pull up to the house. The rear door opened, and Harrison Montgomery emerged, followed by his lawyer and two muscular men Tommy had never seen before. "Mrs. Wilson," Tommy called urgently, backing toward Thunderbolt's stall. She appeared from the tack room, a saddle soap rag still in her hand. Her eyes narrowed at the sight of the visitors approaching across the yard. "Stay with Thunderbolt," she instructed quietly. "I'll handle this." From inside the barn, Tommy watched as Mrs. Wilson met the group halfway across the yard. Montgomery's voice carried clearly in the evening air. "Martha, I've come to resolve this situation amicably," he announced, as if conferring a great favor. "The boy has become attached to Thunderbolt, which is understandable. But the animal needs specialized care that he simply cannot provide." Mrs. Wilson crossed her arms. "Seems to me he's providing exactly what that horse needs, something your expensive specialists failed to do." Montgomery's lawyer stepped forward, opening a leather portfolio. "Mr. Montgomery is prepared to offer $5,000 to purchase the animal. A more than generous offer considering the circumstances." Tommy's heart pounded as he pressed against Thunderbolt's stall door. The horse sensed his distress, moving closer to nuzzle his shoulder. $5,000 was more money than Tommy had ever imagined possessing. Enough to help the Pearsons, enough to secure his future in ways he'd never dared dream. But the very idea of selling Thunderbolt made him physically ill. The barn door creaked as Tommy pushed it open and stepped outside. "He's not for sale," he called, his voice steadier than he expected. "Not at any price." Montgomery turned, his practiced smile failing to mask the coldness in his eyes. "Young man, be reasonable. That horse needs specialized medical attention, equipment maintenance, proper facilities. Things a boy in your situation simply cannot provide long-term." "My situation?" Tommy repeated, approaching slowly. Montgomery's smile thinned. "Let's be frank. You're a ward of the state. Your living situation is inherently unstable. What happens to Thunderbolt when you're moved to another foster home? Perhaps one that doesn't accommodate your hobby?" The calculated cruelty of the question struck Tommy like a physical blow. It was his deepest fear, articulated precisely, that his time with Thunderbolt, like everything else in his life, was temporary. Before Tommy could respond, Montgomery's facade cracked entirely. "That horse made me look incompetent," he snapped, color rising in his face. "Nobody is going to believe a 12-year-old boy tamed what my best trainers couldn't. Do you have any idea what that's doing to my reputation? To my business?" The raw truth hung in the autumn air. This had never been about Thunderbolt's welfare or Tommy's situation. It had always been about Montgomery's pride. As the men moved toward the barn where Thunderbolt waited, an unexpected sound broke the tension. Car engines. Headlights appeared on the access road, not one set, but many, approaching the ranch in a steady stream. The first vehicle to pull in was Sheriff Jackson's patrol car, followed by the Pearsons' sedan. Behind them came Sarah Donovan's truck with several of her riding students in the bed, Dr. Matthews's veterinary van, and a parade of other vehicles, neighbors, teachers, even a few retired jockeys Tommy recognized from photographs in Mrs. Wilson's albums. "What is this?" Montgomery demanded as people began emerging from their vehicles, forming a loose semicircle around the confrontation. "Looks like a community to me," Sheriff Jackson observed mildly, approaching with his thumbs hooked in his belt. "Folks heard you might be visiting the ranch today. Thought they'd stop by too." Mr. Pearson made his way to Tommy's side, placing a supportive hand on his shoulder. "Everything all right here, son?" "Yes, sir," Tommy replied, drawing strength from the unexpected show of support. Sheriff Jackson turned to Montgomery, his expression hardening. "You can take this to court if you'd like, Harrison. But then we'd have to discuss those altered veterinary reports we found during our investigation. And the witnesses who've come forward about how you treated your defective horses." For the first time since Tommy had known of him, Harrison Montgomery appeared genuinely unsettled. His gaze swept over the gathered crowd, noting faces of people he'd considered under his influence: business associates, potential clients, community leaders. Most telling was his son Brad, standing awkwardly at the edge of the group, looking at his father with a mixture of defiance and shame. "This isn't over," Montgomery stated, but the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. With a curt nod to his lawyer and assistants, he turned back toward his car. As the black Lincoln drove away, Tommy felt something inside him release, a knot of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. He turned to find Mrs. Wilson at his side, her eyes suspiciously bright. "Told you miracles still happen in Kentucky," she murmured. Later that night, after the impromptu gathering had dispersed with promises of help for the upcoming festival, Tommy sat alone with Thunderbolt under a sky brilliant with stars. The horse rested his head gently against the boy's shoulder in a gesture that had become their private ritual of connection. "We're going to be okay," Tommy whispered, and for the first time in his life, he actually believed it. Cornered by the crowd and the mounting evidence against him, Harrison Montgomery retreated temporarily, but as he departed, he cast one final look at Thunderbolt and announced audibly, "This festival will be the last day this horse appears in public. I have friends throughout the Kentucky circuit, and none of you has any idea what's coming." Words that sent a chill down Tommy's spine as he protectively embraced Thunderbolt's neck. Montgomery's threat echoed in Tommy's mind for days afterward, following him like a shadow through his morning chores and evening rides. The man's parting words had carried a conviction that left Tommy constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting some new attack to materialize from the Kentucky hills surrounding Wilson Ranch. "You can't let him get in your head," Mrs. Wilson advised one morning, noticing Tommy's distraction as he mechanically filled water buckets. "That's exactly what he wants." Tommy nodded, but couldn't shake the uneasiness. The festival's only 2 weeks away. What if he tries something before then? Then we'll handle it, just like we've handled everything else. She handed him a curry comb. "Now go finish getting Thunderbolt ready. Sarah's coming by to help you practice your pattern for the competition." As Tommy approached Thunderbolt's stall, he found the horse watching him with that peculiar intensity that still sometimes caught him off guard, as if the animal could read his thoughts. In the 3 months since the auction, the former champion had transformed from a dangerous outcast into a cautious but willing partner. His coat gleamed with health, and he carried his prosthetic leg with remarkable adaptation, compensating for its limitations with subtle shifts in his gait that spoke to his intelligence and determination. "Morning, buddy," Tommy said, offering an apple on his flat palm. "Ready to work today?" Thunderbolt's ears pricked forward at the familiar voice, but Tommy noticed a new tension in the horse's posture, a slight bracing, as if anticipating trouble. Animals, Mrs. Wilson often reminded him, sensed emotional undercurrents that humans tried to hide. "I'm nervous too," Tommy admitted, stroking the horse's neck. "But we've got each other, right?" For the next hour, Tommy and Thunderbolt worked with Sarah Donovan in the small practice ring behind the barn. The riding instructor was patient but exacting, correcting Tommy's posture and guiding him through the basic pattern they would need to execute at the festival. "Remember, judges will be looking at how you two work together, not just technical perfection," Sarah explained, watching as Tommy guided Thunderbolt through a simple figure 8. The connection between horse and rider matters more than anything, especially in the juvenile division. Tommy nodded, concentrating on maintaining light contact with the reins while keeping his legs steady. Despite his inexperience, he'd developed an intuitive understanding with Thunderbolt that more seasoned riders often commented on with surprise. "He knows what I'm thinking before I do sometimes," Tommy explained to Sarah when she remarked on how smoothly they navigated a tight turn. "That's rare," Sarah replied. "Some riders spend decades trying to develop that kind of partnership." As they finished the lesson, Tommy noticed his hands trembling slightly. Not from physical exertion, but from the growing weight of expectation. What had begun as a simple desire to give a discarded horse a second chance had somehow transformed into something much bigger, something that felt almost like destiny. That evening, as Tommy brushed Thunderbolt down after their workout, Mrs. Wilson appeared at the stall door with an unusual invitation. "When you're finished here, come up to the house. I'd like to share a special tea with you, something Arthur and I used to do before important events." Tommy found Mrs. Wilson on the porch, a small cast-iron teapot steaming between two chipped mugs on the weathered table. The evening air carried the scent of autumn, fallen leaves, distant wood smoke, and the promise of frost. "Arthur called this decision tea," she explained, pouring a rich amber liquid into Tommy's mug. "Whenever we faced a crossroads, we'd sit together, drink this blend, and talk things through until the path forward became clear." Tommy wrapped his hands around the warm mug, inhaling the spicy aroma. "I'm scared," he admitted, the words easier to speak in the gathering dusk. "Not just of Montgomery, but of letting Thunderbolt down. What if I freeze up in front of all those people?" Mrs. Wilson's smile was gentle. "Then you'll unfreeze and continue. That's all any of us can do." She rose suddenly, disappearing into the house and returning moments later with an old wooden chest. Setting it carefully on the table, she lifted the lid to reveal a collection of papers, photographs, and small mementos. "Arthur kept records," she explained, removing a stack of yellowed envelopes. "For years, he documented everything he witnessed at the major stables around Kentucky, the good and the bad. He believed that someday the truth would matter." Tommy leaned forward, examining a photograph of a much younger Arthur Wilson standing beside a beautiful bay horse. Was he a trainer? The best in the state, though you won't find his name in any record books now. Arthur was the head trainer at Clearwater Stables until he spoke out against Montgomery Sr.'s methods in the late 70s. Her voice took on a hard edge. "They destroyed him systematically. Rumors about drinking, accusations of mistreating horses, blacklisting among owners. Everything he'd built was gone within a year." She carefully spread several envelopes across the table. Before he died, Arthur wrote these letters to key figures in the racing world, documenting decades of abuses he'd witnessed. Evidence too, photos and testimony from former employees. Her fingers traced the faded addresses. He never sent them. Said the time wasn't right, that no one would believe him against the Montgomery name. Tommy stared at the letters, understanding the weight of what Mrs. Wilson was sharing. "And now?" "Now I think it's time these found their way to their destinations." She met Tommy's eyes with quiet determination. "Arthur died believing he'd failed to change anything. I won't let his truth die with him." Together, they prepared the envelopes for mailing, Tommy helping Mrs. Wilson check addresses and affix stamps. The simple act felt profound, setting in motion a reckoning that had been decades in the making. "Even if this doesn't change anything for tomorrow," Mrs. Wilson said as they sealed the final envelope, "the truth deserves to be known." That night, as Tommy pedaled home under a canopy of stars, he felt a curious lightness despite the challenges ahead. There was power in truth, in standing up for what was right, even when victory seemed impossible. Wasn't that what he'd been trying to teach Thunderbolt all along? That past hurts didn't determine future possibilities. The next 12 days passed in a blur of preparation. Each morning, Tommy arrived at the ranch before dawn to work with Thunderbolt, gradually building their routine for the festival. Sarah visited regularly, fine-tuning their performance and helping Tommy understand the festival protocols. How to enter the arena, how to acknowledge the judges, how to handle the pressure of a large audience. Meanwhile, Thunderbolt underwent his own transformation. The horse who once trembled at sudden movements now stood calmly as Tommy practiced adjusting equipment, while others moved around the barn. His eyes, once clouded with fear and distrust, now followed Tommy with steady attention, communicating in a silent language they'd developed together. "He centered himself through you," Dr. Matthews observed during a checkup visit. "I've seen therapy horses do this, find their emotional balance through connection with a specific person. It's remarkable in a horse with his history." The night before the festival, the ranch came alive with unexpected activity. Sarah arrived with several of her students to help polish tack and braid Thunderbolt's mane. Pete Simmons, the retired farrier, made a special trip to check the prosthetic one final time. The Pearsons brought a picnic dinner for everyone, and Mrs. Wilson broke out a bottle of sparkling cider she'd been saving for a special occasion. As darkness fell and the impromptu gathering continued around a small bonfire in the yard, Tommy slipped away to the barn. He found Thunderbolt standing alert in his stall, ears pricked toward the unusual sounds of celebration. "Big day tomorrow," Tommy said, leaning against the stall door. "But I want you to know something." He reached in to stroke the horse's neck. "No matter what happens, whether we win or come in last, you've already won the most important race. You chose to trust again, even after everything that happened to you." Thunderbolt lowered his head until his muzzle rested against Tommy's chest, their breathing synchronizing in the quiet barn. For several minutes they remained that way, boy and horse, connected by something deeper than words could express. The moment was interrupted by the sound of running footsteps. Tommy turned to find Brad Montgomery in the barn doorway, his face flushed and breathing heavy. "You need to know something," Brad said without preamble. "My dad is planning something for tomorrow." Tommy felt his stomach drop. "What kind of something?" "I overheard him on the phone with one of the judges," Brad explained, glancing nervously toward the house as if expecting to be discovered. "Some arrangement about technical disqualification if they can find any excuse." Tommy nodded slowly, not entirely surprised. "We figured he might try something like that." "There's more," Brad continued, his voice dropping lower. "He's hired people to make loud noises or set off firecrackers near the arena when you're performing. He wants Thunderbolt to freak out, to prove he's dangerous." The cruelty of the plan made Tommy's chest tighten with anger. After everything Thunderbolt had overcome, to deliberately trigger his trauma for public humiliation seemed almost inconceivably cruel. "Why are you telling me this?" Tommy asked, studying Brad's face in the dim barn light. "Because it's wrong," Brad replied simply, "and because that day at the ranch when I was being a total jerk, I saw something in the way that horse looked at you. Something I've never seen at my father's stables, no matter how many champions he breeds." That night, Tommy couldn't sleep. He tossed in his bed, Montgomery's threat mingling with Brad's warning to create nightmare scenarios. Around 3 in the morning, he finally gave up, dressing quietly in the darkness and slipping out to the kitchen where he left a note for the Pearsons. "Went early to check on Thunderbolt. See you at the festival." The ride to Wilson Ranch was peaceful, the roads empty in the pre-dawn darkness. When Tommy arrived, he found Mrs. Wilson already awake, a mug of coffee warming her hands as she sat on the porch. "Couldn't sleep either?" she asked, unsurprised by his early arrival. Tommy shook his head. "Too much thinking. That'll happen before big days." She nodded toward the barn. "He's been restless too. Keeps looking toward the road like he's expecting you." In the quiet stillness of early morning, Tommy sat in the straw beside Thunderbolt, leaning against the wall of the stall. The horse remained standing, but positioned himself protectively near the boy, occasionally lowering his head to nudge Tommy's shoulder gently. "Tomorrow is just you and me, friend," Tommy murmured softly. "Like it's always been." As the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky, Tommy awoke to find Thunderbolt already standing alert, watching him intently. The horse did something extraordinary then. He walked deliberately to the corner of the stall where the saddle hung and touched it with his muzzle, as if saying, "I'm ready." At that exact moment, Tommy's phone vibrated with an anonymous message. "Montgomery has hired 3 men to ensure you never reach the arena." Tommy's hand trembled as he read the anonymous message again. 3 men hired to prevent them from even reaching the arena. The phone's glow illuminated Thunderbolt's watchful eyes in the pre-dawn darkness, reflecting a determination that steadied Tommy's racing heart. "Sheriff Jackson needs to see this," he whispered, forwarding the message immediately. The response came within minutes. "Don't leave the ranch. We're coming to you." As the eastern sky lightened from black to deep blue, headlights appeared on the access road. Tommy tensed until he recognized Sheriff Jackson's patrol car leading a small convoy. The sheriff emerged, followed by 2 deputies and Mr. Pearson, whose worried face relaxed visibly upon seeing Tommy safe in the barn doorway. "Got your message," Sheriff Jackson said, his voice low and serious. "We've been monitoring chatter since yesterday. 3 men were spotted at the Crossroads Motel last night, out-of-towners with connections to security firms Montgomery has used before." Mrs. Wilson appeared from the house, a shotgun casually resting in the crook of her arm. "I see we're having an early morning strategy session." The sheriff nodded respectfully at the weapon. "Won't be necessary, Martha, but I appreciate the sentiment." He turned to Tommy. "We're arranging a special escort to get you and Thunderbolt to the festival. Different route than anyone would expect." As dawn broke fully over Wilson Ranch, an unusual caravan assembled. Thunderbolt was loaded into Pete Simmons' old horse trailer, which had been carefully inspected by Dr. Matthews to ensure the prosthetic would remain stable during transport. Instead of heading directly to the festival grounds, they took a circuitous route through back roads, Sheriff Jackson's patrol car leading and 2 deputies following behind. "Never thought I'd be getting a police escort to a horse show," Tommy remarked, trying to mask his nervousness with humor as he sat between Mrs. Wilson and Mr. Pearson in Pete's truck. "It's not the escort you deserve, but it's the one you need," Mrs. Pearson replied from the front passenger seat, reaching back to squeeze his hand. "And you deserve much more." The Kentucky Horse Festival grounds sprawled across the rolling hills outside Louisville, white tents and colorful flags visible from miles away. By the time their convoy approached the competitors' entrance, the morning sun had burned away the autumn mist, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. Horses being unloaded, riders in various states of preparation, officials scurrying between venues with clipboards and radios. What Tommy hadn't expected was the crowd already gathered near the entrance, many holding homemade signs, "Let Thunderbolt run," "Second chances," and even "Tommy and Thunderbolt, Kentucky's new champions." News vans from local stations and even a national sports network had set up broadcast positions. "What's happening?" Tommy asked, shrinking back in his seat as he spotted camera crews turning toward their approaching vehicles. "Your story got out," Sarah Donovan explained, appearing beside the truck as they parked in the competitors' area. "Martha gave an interview to the Courier-Journal yesterday. It went viral overnight." Indeed, Mrs. Wilson found herself surrounded by reporters the moment she stepped from the truck, handling their questions with the straightforward dignity that characterized everything she did. Yes, it's true that powerful interests tried to prevent this boy and his remarkable horse from competing today. Make of that what you will. Meanwhile, Dr. Matthews supervised Thunderbolt's unloading, checking the prosthetic one final time. "Everything looks perfect," he confirmed, patting the horse's gleaming flank. "You're ready." The juvenile division wasn't scheduled until early afternoon, giving Tommy precious hours to settle Thunderbolt in the temporary stabling provided for competitors. The horse remained surprisingly calm despite the unfamiliar surroundings and constant activity, his eyes frequently seeking Tommy as if to confirm they were still facing this challenge together. As their performance time approached, Tommy changed into the outfit Sarah had helped assemble: clean black breeches, a white button-down shirt, and a borrowed show jacket that Mrs. Wilson had altered to fit his slender frame. The clothes felt strange, formal, in a way that heightened his awareness of being an outsider in this world of tradition and privilege. Sarah found him adjusting the jacket's sleeves nervously. "Remember," she said, straightening his collar, "it doesn't matter what happens out there. What you two have already accomplished is the real miracle." From the warm-up area, Tommy could see the main arena where the juvenile division would compete. The grandstands were filling rapidly, far more crowded than anyone had expected for what was usually a sparsely attended category. Near the judge's box, he spotted Harrison Montgomery in the VIP section, his face an unreadable mask as he surveyed the proceedings. "Don't look at him," Mrs. Wilson advised, appearing at Tommy's elbow. "Focus on your horse, your pattern, nothing else." Tommy nodded, turning his attention back to Thunderbolt. The horse stood calmly beside him, the prosthetic leg gleaming in the sunlight. 3 months ago, this scene would have been unimaginable. A traumatized, aggressive animal deemed beyond saving. now poised to enter a show ring as a competitor. As they waited for their turn, Tommy whispered into Thunderbolt's ear, "Just like we practiced. Nothing fancy. Just you and me." When their number was finally called, Tommy mounted with practiced ease, settling into the saddle that had become a familiar extension of their partnership. The arena entrance loomed before them, a gateway to public judgment. "Next competitor in the juvenile division," announced the commentator. "Number 23, Thomas Reynolds riding Thunderbolt." As they entered the arena, the crowd's reaction startled Tommy. Applause erupted, far louder than for any previous competitor. He felt Thunderbolt tense beneath him, ears swiveling at the unexpected sound. "Easy," Tommy murmured, stroking the horse's neck reassuringly. "They're cheering for you, buddy." Their pattern began simply enough, walking a precise square, demonstrating control and communication. Thunderbolt moved with surprising grace, his prosthetic leg hardly noticeable in the fluid rhythm of his gait. As they transitioned into a trot, Tommy felt the horse's confidence building beneath him, matching his own growing certainty. Then, without warning, a piercing squeal of feedback erupted from the sound system, producing painful static that echoed around the arena. Tommy immediately recognized it as the sabotage Brad had warned about, an accidental technical issue designed to spook Thunderbolt. Any other horse with Thunderbolt's history might have panicked, bolting or bucking in terror at the sudden assault on sensitive ears. Instead, the black horse stiffened momentarily, his stride faltering. But then Tommy leaned forward, whispering directly into Thunderbolt's ear, his words inaudible to the audience, but carrying a lifetime of shared trust. "I'm right here. We're okay. Nothing can hurt us when we're together." Remarkably, Thunderbolt steadied, continuing their pattern despite the disruptive noise that persisted for several seconds before technicians scrambled to correct it. In the judges' box, Tommy noticed several heads nodding with grudging respect at the horse's composure under pressure. As they approached the center of the arena for their final figure, something extraordinary happened. Thunderbolt suddenly stopped, the abrupt halt nearly unseating Tommy. From the VIP section, Harrison Montgomery leaned forward with a malicious smile, clearly anticipating the disaster he'd engineered. Instead, Thunderbolt shifted his weight deliberately, and before Tommy could process what was happening, the horse began executing a series of movements no one had taught him. Movements Tommy recognized from videos of classical dressage, a perfect half-pass, followed by a shoulder-in, then rising into a controlled rear that showcased extraordinary balance despite the prosthetic leg. The arena fell silent, spectators and judges alike transfixed by the unexpected display of advanced training. Even the commentator, a retired Olympic equestrian, seemed momentarily speechless before finding his voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing. This is extraordinary. This horse is demonstrating movements from his previous classical training. He's choosing to perform them. In 40 years of equestrian commentary, I've never seen anything quite like this." Tommy remained perfectly still in the saddle, understanding instinctively that Thunderbolt was communicating something profound, reclaiming his identity as an athlete, proving to everyone watching that his spirit remained unbroken despite his physical limitations. When the performance concluded, 3 seconds of absolute silence gripped the arena before the crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Veterans of the equestrian world removed their hats in respect. Judges conferred urgently, bending the rules of the competition in real time to acknowledge what they had witnessed. The head judge, a silver-haired woman who had competed internationally for decades, approached the microphone with visible emotion. "The judges have unanimously decided to create a special award category today. The Spirit of Kentucky Award, presented to Thomas Reynolds and Thunderbolt for demonstrating the true essence of the partnership between human and horse." As Tommy and Thunderbolt exited the arena to continuing applause, they found themselves surrounded by well-wishers, reporters, and fellow competitors. Through the crowd, Tommy spotted a familiar figure approaching, Harrison Montgomery, his face rigid with controlled emotion, a reluctant Brad trailing behind him. "My son would like to apologize," Montgomery stated stiffly, nudging Brad forward. The teenager extended a trembling hand to Tommy. "I'm sorry," he said, the words barely audible but sincere. "For everything." Montgomery himself seemed to be waging an internal battle before adding grudgingly, "And I must acknowledge when I'm wrong. That is an exceptional horse." That evening, as sunset painted the Kentucky hills in gold and crimson, Tommy sat with Thunderbolt in a quiet corner of the festival grounds. The horse dozed lightly, exhausted but content, his head occasionally dropping to rest against Tommy's shoulder. Mrs. Wilson found them there, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Arthur would have loved today," she said softly. "He always believed true horsemanship wasn't about ribbons or trophies. It was about moments like this, when human and horse choose each other, again and again." 3 years later, the Second Chance Ranch occupies 10 acres of what was once Mrs. Wilson's property, now expanded thanks to donations and a municipal equine therapy program. Tommy, officially adopted by the Pearsons, works with children from the foster system and rescued horses. Thunderbolt, the star of the ranch, demonstrates infinite patience with frightened children who see in him a symbol of overcoming adversity.